The air was thick with the dust of decay, a suffocating cloud of rotten grain that clung to the back of his throat and burned his eyes. For 14 days, this concrete silo had been his entire world, a vertical tomb he was desperately trying to excavate. At 13 years old, Harlan Dean Whitaker was little more than skin stretched over bone, his muscles screaming with a fatigue so profound it felt permanent. His shovel, a borrowed tool that felt impossibly heavy, struck something that wasn't earth or compacted wheat. It was a dull, solid thud that vibrated up the handle and into his very soul. He dropped to his knees, clawing away the last layers of filth with raw fingers until the dark, curved top of an oak barrel emerged from the gloom. With the last of his strength, he pried its bung loose. A rich, unfamiliar aroma of aged whiskey, of oak and rye and time itself, filled the space, and the boy, Harlan, simply collapsed against the barrel, weeping with an intensity that shook his entire frame. A moment like that, born from such profound desperation and ending in a flood of tears, carries a story that deserves to be told from its very beginning. If you're already feeling the weight of this scene and want to know how a young boy ended up in such a place, let us know where you're listening from in the comments below. Your support, through a simple like or by subscribing to our channel, is what allows these important narratives to be shared. We promise you this is a journey worth following to its powerful conclusion, a testament to a promise that refused to be broken by the cruelty of the world. But to understand why the smell of whiskey made a 13-year-old boy cry in a forgotten silo in the summer of 1931, we must go back. We must travel back 2 weeks, to a night when the Nebraska sky was torn open by a violent August storm. The rain fell in sheets, turning the world to mud and shadow, and the sound of thunder was almost enough to drown out the enraged screams of an uncle who had just gambled away everything. This story doesn't begin with a discovery deep beneath the earth. It begins with an act of betrayal that threw a child out into the storm, leaving him with nothing but a soaked coat and the ghost of a mother's last words. Harlan Dean Whitaker was a boy made of dust and silence. At 13, his world had shrunk to the boundaries of the decaying Whitaker homestead, a patch of Nebraska earth that seemed to hold its breath in a perpetual state of sorrow. It had been 3 years since the accident, 3 years since the world had color and sound, since the scent of his mother's baking filled the kitchen, and the steady presence of his father was a shield against any fear. Now, the farm was a monument to what was lost. The fences sagged like tired shoulders. The barn door hung from a single hinge, and the fields lay fallow, their soil cracked and thirsty under the relentless sun. Harlan moved through this landscape of neglect not as a boy, but as a caretaker to a grave, his own youth buried somewhere out there with the parents he could only faintly remember. His existence was a quiet apology for the space he took up, for the air he breathed. His uncle, Vernon Whitaker, was the warden of this quiet prison. A man hollowed out by bitterness and cheap whiskey, he rarely spoke to Harlan, and when he did, his words were like stones thrown from a distance. He never used Harlan's name. It was always just boy, a label that stripped him of identity and reduced him to a function, a pair of hands to do the work Vernon no longer had the heart for. The small pension that came each month, a pittance from the government meant for Harlan's care, would disappear within a day of its arrival, spent in the smoky back room of the town saloon. Vernon would return late at night, his heavy, stumbling footsteps on the porch, a drumbeat of impending misery. The smell of alcohol would fill the small house, a suffocating cloud of resentment that lingered for days, a constant reminder that Harlan was not family, but a burden. Each day began before the sun, with the chill of the wooden floorboards seeping into the soles of his bare feet. His life was a litany of chores, a relentless cycle of labor that left his young body aching with a fatigue far beyond his years. He would haul water from the well, his thin arms straining under the weight of the buckets. He would mend the endless stretches of broken fence with wire and hope, tend to the few scrawny chickens that were their only reliable source of food, and spend hours in the fields, pulling weeds that grew with more determination than any crop. It was the work of a full-grown man, performed by a child in exchange for a cot in the attic, and a daily meal that was often little more than stale bread and water. This was the silent agreement he lived by. His labor for Vernon's tolerance, his silence for a roof over his head. He learned to live in the margins, to become as unobtrusive as a shadow on the wall. He perfected the art of being invisible, of anticipating Vernon's moods by the way he slammed the door, or the depth of the silence that followed him into a room. The feeling of being unwanted was a physical presence, a constant weight in his chest that made it difficult to breathe. He ate his meals quickly and quietly, his eyes fixed on his plate, never daring to ask for more. In the vast, lonely expanse of the farm, he was utterly alone, a ghost haunting the edges of a life that was no longer his. He spoke so little that sometimes he would go to the barn just to whisper to the chickens, simply to remember the sound of his own voice and reassure himself that he still existed. Sometimes, in the quiet moments just before sleep, he would allow himself to remember. He would conjure the image of his mother, her hands covered in flour, her smile a beacon of warmth that could chase away any chill. He remembered her voice, a low, gentle hum as she sang while she worked. He remembered his father, tall and strong, lifting him onto his shoulders so he could see the entire world from the edge of their property. These memories were a double-edged sword. They were the only source of love he had left, but they also carved out the emptiness of his present life with painful precision. The farm, as it was now, was a desecration of their memory, and he felt a profound, unspoken guilt for being unable to stop its slow, inevitable decay. The town of Broken Bow offered no sanctuary. When he accompanied Vernon on rare trips for supplies, he felt the stares of the townspeople. They were looks of pity, a heavy, suffocating kindness that only served to highlight his miserable situation. He was the orphan boy, the tragic story people whispered about after he had passed. No one intervened, no one offered help beyond a sad smile or a hesitant nod. They saw him as Vernon's responsibility, a private sorrow they were not to interfere with. This collective turning away made his isolation complete. He was not a part of the community. He was a footnote to his family's tragedy, a living reminder of a harvesting accident everyone wished they could forget. He learned to keep his head down, to make his trips into town as quick and silent as possible. His only true possession was a secret. Stitched into the inner lining of his worn, threadbare coat was a folded $5 bill. His mother had put it there just a month before she died, her fingers guiding the needle with a strange urgency. She had cupped his face in her hands and told him, her voice serious, that this was for when life became impossible. It was not for candy or a toy. It was for a moment when there were no other options left. For 3 years, that small, crisp note had been his only source of hope, a tangible link to his mother's love and foresight. In the dead of night, when the loneliness was a physical ache, he would trace the outline of the bill through the fabric, the slight crinkle a whisper of reassurance in the crushing silence of the house. There were moments of small, defiant joy that he carved out for himself. Sometimes, while working near the creek at the edge of the property, he would find a perfectly smooth, flat stone and spend a few precious minutes skipping it across the water's surface. He would watch the ripples expand, a brief, beautiful pattern created by his own hand in a world where he had no control. He would study the clouds, finding the shapes of animals and faces in their slow, silent drift across the vast Nebraska sky. These were stolen seconds of peace, tiny acts of rebellion against the suffocating bleakness of his reality. They were proof that somewhere, deep inside the silent, hard-working boy, there was still a spark of a child who remembered how to dream, even if he no longer knew what to dream for. He also had a deep, abiding fear that lived in the pit of his stomach. It was the fear of Vernon's rage when the whiskey had taken complete control, a volatile, unpredictable storm that could erupt without warning. But there was a deeper fear beneath that one, the terror of being cast out. He knew, with the certainty of an animal sensing a predator, that his position in the house was tenuous. He was an asset only as long as his pension arrived and his labor was needed. If either of those things were to change, he knew Vernon would not hesitate to throw him out. The thought of being completely alone, with no roof and no food, was a horror that haunted his waking hours and stalked him in his sleep. It was this fear that kept him obedient, silent, and hard-working. In the days leading up to that final violent night, the atmosphere on the farm grew heavier, charged with an unspoken tension. Vernon's losses in town were clearly mounting. He started selling off what little they had left, a few tools, a milking cow, anything that could be converted into cash for another poker game. His mood swung wildly from sullen silence to explosive anger over the smallest things, like a misplaced hammer or a slow-to-boil pot of water. Harlan felt the change in the air. It was the same electric stillness that preceded a summer thunderstorm, a palpable sense of impending disaster. He worked harder, stayed quieter, and tried to make himself even smaller. Hoping to weather a storm he knew was inevitable, he had become a keen observer of his uncle's decay, not out of concern, but for survival. He could tell by the slump of Vernon's shoulders when he returned from town if the night had been a loss. He could measure the depth of his uncle's despair by the number of empty bottles left on the kitchen table in the morning. He saw the way Vernon looked at the land, not with the pride of an owner, but with the desperation of a man who was losing his grip. Harlan knew that his own fate was tied to this failing man and this failing farm. He was standing on a precipice, and he could feel the ground beneath his feet beginning to crumble, threatening to send him plunging into the impossible world his mother had warned him about. The storm broke on a Tuesday. It was not a gentle summer rain, but a violent, percussive assault that seemed intent on tearing the sky apart. Rain hammered against the farmhouse roof like 1,000 tiny fists, and the wind howled through the cracks in the walls, a mournful, keening sound that made the old structure groan in protest. Harlan sat at the small kitchen table, tracing patterns in the condensation on a glass of water, the rhythmic drumming of the storm a strangely comforting metronome in the suffocating silence of the house. He had finished his chores hours ago, and now there was nothing left to do but wait for the inevitable return of his uncle. The air inside was thick with anticipation, heavy and electric, as if the storm outside had found its way in, coiling itself in the corners of the room, waiting for a spark to ignite it. He could feel the tension in his own bones, a low, constant hum of anxiety that had become the background music of his life. The sound of the truck engine was nearly lost in the roar of the thunder, a sputtering, angry noise that died abruptly in the muddy drive. A moment later, the front door was thrown open with such force that it slammed against the interior wall, shaking a small framed picture of his parents from its nail. It fell to the floor with a soft thud, the glass mercifully intact. Vernon stood silhouetted in the doorway, a looming figure of pure, unadulterated rage. Rainwater streamed from his hair and the brim of his hat, pooling at his feet on the wooden floorboards. He didn't seem to notice the cold or the wet. His focus was entirely inward, on a fire that was burning him from the inside out. The familiar, sour smell of whiskey preceded him into the room, but tonight it was mixed with something else, something sharper and more terrifying. The metallic scent of absolute ruin. Vernon stumbled into the kitchen, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, his face a mask of fury. His eyes, usually clouded with a dull resentment, were now blazing with a wild, desperate light. He didn't look at Harlan, not at first. Instead, his gaze swept across the meager contents of the room, the worn-out furniture, the peeling paint, the patched curtains, as if seeing them for the first time and hating every single detail. He brought a fist down on the kitchen table, the impact rattling the dishes and making Harlan flinch back. The sound was like a gunshot in the small space, a violent punctuation mark to a sentence that had not yet been spoken. He was a man who had reached the end of his rope, and in his fall, he was determined to drag everything and everyone down with him. The world had shrunken to this single terrifying moment. He finally turned his burning gaze on Harlan, and the boy felt his blood run cold. There was no recognition in his uncle's eyes, only a deep, bottomless well of blame. Vernon's voice, when it came, was a raw, guttural sound torn from his throat. He said the farm was gone. He spat the words out like poison, each one a testament to his own failure. He had lost it all, every last acre, every fence post, every blade of grass, in a final, disastrous hand of poker. The name he uttered next hung in the air, heavy and final. Crawford Pierce. The town banker, a man with a reputation for collecting debts with the cold precision of a mortician, now owned the Whitaker homestead. The deed was signed over. There was no going back. The farm that had been in their family for 3 generations was now nothing more than an asset in a banker's ledger. Harlan sat frozen, the words washing over him without fully sinking in. He couldn't process the magnitude of the loss. The farm, for all its decay and misery, was the only world he knew. It was the last physical connection to his parents, the ground that held their memory. To lose it felt like losing them all over again, a second, more profound kind of orphaning. He tried to speak, to ask a question, but his throat was tight with a fear so primal it stole his breath. He could only stare at his uncle, this broken man who had just gambled away his entire history, and see the terrifying emptiness that lay behind his rage. He saw a man who had nothing left to lose, and he understood with a sudden, chilling clarity that a man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous person in the world. Vernon's rage, having declared its source, now needed a target. His eyes narrowed, focusing on Harlan with a venomous intensity. He took a staggering step forward, his shadow falling over the boy. He began to scream, his voice cracking with whiskey and self-loathing, the words a torrent of long, simmering resentment. He screamed that he was done with the farm, done with the memories, and most of all, done with Harlan. He called the boy a ghost, the useless ghost of his dead brother, a constant, silent reminder of everything he had lost and everything he had failed to be. He said that with the farm no longer his, there was no reason to keep its last, most unprofitable asset. The silent contract of servitude had just been violently, irrevocably voided. Harlan was no longer a burden to be tolerated. He was a liability to be discarded. The threat was no longer implied. It was stark and brutal. Vernon grabbed the front of Harlan's worn shirt, his knuckles digging into the boy's collarbone. He hauled him out of the chair as if he weighed nothing, his grip like an iron band. Harlan's feet scraped against the floor as he was dragged from the kitchen, through the small living room and toward the still-open front door. The storm raged outside, a perfect mirror of the chaos that had just consumed his life. He didn't fight, didn't struggle. He was paralyzed by a shock so profound it felt like he was watching it happen to someone else. This was it. This was the moment his deepest fear had always whispered about in the dark, the moment he would be cast out into the impossible world his mother had warned him about. Vernon shoved him onto the porch, the rough, splintered wood scraping against his back. The cold rain was an immediate, violent shock to his system, plastering his thin shirt to his skin and stealing the warmth from his body in an instant. His uncle stood over him, his face contorted in a sneer of finality. He screamed that he was done feeding him, done clothing him, done giving him a roof over his head. Every word was a hammer blow, shattering the last fragile remnants of Harlan's world. With a final, furious shove, Vernon pushed him off the porch. Harlan tumbled down the 3 short steps, landing hard in the thick, cold mud of the yard. The impact knocked the wind out of him, and he lay there, gasping for air, the taste of rain and dirt in his mouth. He looked up just in time to see the front door slam shut with a deafening crack that seemed to echo the thunder overhead. A second later, he heard the heavy, metallic sound of the bolt sliding into place. That single sound was more final than all of Vernon's screaming. It was the sound of a lock turning not just on a door but on his entire life. He was outside. Vernon was inside. A line had been drawn and he was on the wrong side of it. The farmhouse, which had been his prison for 3 long years, suddenly looked like the only sanctuary in the entire world, and it was forever closed to him. The yellow light in the kitchen window was extinguished, plunging the house into the same darkness that now surrounded him completely. Shivering, soaked to the bone, and covered in mud, Harlan slowly pushed himself to his knees. The rain beat down on him relentlessly, washing the tears from his face before he even knew he was crying. He was 13 years old, standing in the middle of a violent Nebraska storm, with nothing but the clothes on his back. He was utterly terrifyingly alone. The rage from the house had subsided, replaced by an immense, crushing silence broken only by the storm. He was no longer the Whitaker boy, the orphan, the burden. He was nothing. A piece of driftwood cast off in a flood, with no land in sight. The threat had been made real. He was homeless, with no one in the world to turn to, in the heart of a country that was itself collapsing under the weight of its own despair. For a long time, he just lay there, a small discarded thing in the vast churning darkness of the Nebraska plains. The cold mud was a greedy thief, pulling the last vestiges of warmth from his body, while the relentless August rain worked its way into his very bones. Each thunderclap felt like a physical blow, a cosmic affirmation of the violence that had just expelled him from his life. The farmhouse, a mere shadow against a darker sky, was no longer a place of resentment and fear. It had transformed in an instant into a symbol of all he had lost, a fortress whose bolted door was a final, damning judgment on his worth. The world had not just forgotten him, it had actively ejected him, and the sound of that lock sliding home was the sound of his existence being erased. He was an anchorless ship in a violent sea, with the shore having just deliberately and finally vanished from view. The initial shock, a merciful numbness that had frozen his mind, began to recede, replaced by the piercing reality of his situation. This was not a temporary rage that would cool by morning. He understood with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the ground beneath him, that Vernon would not be opening that door. To his uncle, he was a problem that had just been solved, a ghost that had finally been exorcised. To remain here, huddled on the edge of the property, waiting for a dawn that would bring no pity, was to choose a slow, miserable end. The cold was no longer just a discomfort. It was an active threat, a relentless enemy that was already winning. A decision began to form, not from a place of courage or logic, but from the most primal instinct a living creature possesses, the absolute, non-negotiable need to survive. To stay was to die. But the instinct to flee was met with a powerful opposing force, a despair so profound it felt like gravity, pinning him to the earth. Where could he possibly go? He was a 13-year-old boy with no money, no family, and no one in the world who would even notice his absence. The words his uncle had screamed at him echoed in his mind, a cruel litany of his own uselessness. He was a ghost, a burden, an unprofitable asset. For a terrifying moment, the mud felt like a comfortable grave. It would be so easy to simply stop, to let the cold and the rain have their way, to surrender to the immense crushing weight of his own solitude. The thought was a dark, seductive whisper, promising an end to the pain, the fear, and the relentless, gnawing loneliness that had been his constant companion for 3 long years. It promised a final, silent peace. It was in that moment of near surrender that his left hand, twitching with cold, brushed against the rough wool of his coat. The movement was involuntary, a simple reflex, but it sent a jolt through his entire being. His fingers, numb and clumsy, fumbled at the inner lining, searching for the familiar, slightly raised rectangle of fabric his mother had so carefully stitched there years ago. He felt it, a small, hard promise hidden within the worn material. Her face swam into his memory, not faded and distant, but sharp and clear. Her eyes filled with a love so fierce it felt like a physical warmth spreading through his chest. He heard her voice, a low, urgent whisper against the howl of the storm, repeating the words that had become his only inheritance, for when life gets impossible. This was not just a difficult moment. This was the impossible moment she had foreseen. That memory was the spark that ignited a fire. The $5 bill was no longer just a secret piece of paper. It was a mandate, a final instruction from the one person who had ever truly loved him. It was a tool, a weapon, a shield she had left behind. To surrender now would not just be his own defeat. It would be a betrayal of her last act of protection. The despair did not vanish, but it was pushed back by a new, more powerful emotion, a sense of profound, desperate purpose. He had to honor her foresight. He had to make her sacrifice, her final thought for his safety, mean something. The decision was no longer a panicked flight for survival. It became a solemn vow. He would live. He would take this impossible gift and turn it into a future, no matter how small or uncertain that future might be. A plan, raw and unformed, began to crystallize in his mind. He had to get away from the farm, away from the ghost of Vernon Whitaker. The nearest place that offered any possibility of anonymity, any chance of disappearing into a crowd, was the town of Broken Bow. It was 20 kilometers away, a formidable distance on a clear day for a boy with a full stomach. On a night like this, soaked, freezing, and exhausted, it felt like a journey to the other side of the moon, but it was the only direction that made sense. It was a single point of light in an otherwise suffocating darkness. The journey itself would be a trial, a brutal test of his newfound resolve, but the thought of staying, of seeing Vernon's face in the morning light, was infinitely more terrifying than any challenge the open road could present. Before he could move, he felt an overwhelming need to say goodbye, not to the man inside the house, but to the land itself, the soil that held the last echoes of his parents. He crawled on his hands and knees through the thick mud to the slight rise near the sagging fence line, a spot from where he could see the entire homestead laid out before him. He looked at the dark shape of the barn, the skeletal form of the windmill, and the small unmarked patch of earth behind the house where his mother and father were buried. He couldn't see their graves, but he knew they were there. A silent farewell formed in his thoughts, a promise that he would remember them, that he would carry their memory with him wherever he went. He was leaving behind the only world he had ever known, and the act felt like a physical tearing, a severing of roots that ran deeper than he had ever realized. With his farewell made, he turned his attention back to the immediate practical task of preparation. His fingers, stiff and uncooperative, worked at the thick threads his mother had used to secure the bill. He was careful, even in his haste, not to rip the delicate lining of the coat. He didn't pull the money out completely, not yet. He just needed to feel the crisp edge of the paper against his skin, to confirm its reality. The faint crinkle of the bill was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard, a tiny note of hope in the grand, violent symphony of the storm. It was real. It was his. This small, folded piece of paper was now his entire world, the sum total of his assets and the foundation of whatever came next. It was everything, and it had to be enough. He forced himself to think past the immediate cold and pain, to confront the very real dangers of the journey ahead. The road to Broken Bow was a lonely, unlit stretch of dirt track that cut through miles of empty prairie. The darkness was absolute, filled with the unseen rustlings of nocturnal animals and the disorienting howl of the wind. Every shadow would be a threat, every strange sound a potential monster. Fear, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way back into his heart. He had to build a wall against it, to focus only on the next step, and then the one after that. He pictured his mother's face again, using her memory as a shield against the terror that threatened to paralyze him. He was no longer just Harlan, the orphan boy. He was the keeper of a promise, and that gave him a strength he didn't know he possessed. The rhythm of the storm began to change. The violent, percussive drumming of the rain on the packed earth softened slightly, and the intervals between the claps of thunder grew longer. A subtle shift occurred in the quality of the darkness. The impenetrable black of midnight began to give way to the deep, bruised purple that precedes the dawn. This was his signal, the trigger he had been waiting for. He knew he had to be gone before the first true light of day revealed him, a lone, pathetic figure on the road. The coming of the sun was not a promise of warmth and safety, but a deadline. He had a few precious hours of darkness left to put as much distance as possible between himself and the Whitaker farm. The time for hesitation was over. With a groan that was part pain and part determination, Harlan pushed himself up from the mud. His muscles screamed in protest, his limbs heavy and unresponsive. He stood there for a moment, swaying on his feet, a solitary figure caked in the earth that had almost claimed him. He took one last look at the dark, silent farmhouse, a place that had been his home and his prison. Then he turned his back on it, deliberately and finally. He faced the muddy road that led west, toward a town he barely knew and a future he could not begin to imagine. He took a single, deliberate step, his worn boot making a soft, sucking sound as it pulled free from the mud. It was the first step away from everything he had ever known, and the first step toward the impossible promise he was now determined to keep. The first kilometer was a battle fought not against distance, but against the earth itself. The muddy road, saturated by the relentless storm, was a greedy, living thing, clinging to his boots with a thick, viscous suction that threatened to pull him down with every step. Each footfall was a conscious effort, a deliberate act of will that required lifting his leg against the combined weight of his waterlogged clothes and the clinging, heavy soil. The cold had settled deep into his bones, a shivering internal tremor that made his teeth chatter uncontrollably. His thin coat, a garment meant for crisp autumn days, offered no protection against the driving August rain. It was just a heavy, sodden skin that trapped the chill against his own. He focused on the rhythm of his own ragged breathing, the sound a small, human counterpoint to the vast, indifferent howl of the wind sweeping across the open plains of Nebraska. He was moving, but it felt less like walking and more like wading through a river of mud, with the shore an impossibly distant dream. He reached the edge of the Whitaker property, marked by a sagging barbed wire fence and a wide wooden gate that had always been difficult to open, even on a dry day. Now its waterlogged timbers were swollen tight against the gateposts, and the ground beneath it had turned to a deep, impassable mire. For a moment, a wave of pure, unadulterated despair washed over him. To be defeated here, within sight of the house he had just escaped, felt like a uniquely cruel joke. He threw his shoulder against the rough wood, grunting with the effort, but it refused to budge. He tried again, his feet slipping in the mud, his palms scraping against the splintered surface. He was small, underfed, and exhausted, and the gate was a silent, immovable giant. He felt a sob rising in his throat, a sound of utter defeat, but he choked it back, transforming the noise into a raw, desperate cry of exertion as he gave it one last, final shove. With a groan of tortured wood and the sickening sound of mud releasing its grip, the gate moved. It only opened a foot, just enough space for his thin frame to squeeze through, but it was enough. The small victory sent a surge of adrenaline through him, a jolt of renewed purpose that momentarily pushed back the encroaching cold and fatigue. He slipped through the gap, the sharp barbs on the wire snagging his coat and tearing a small gash in the fabric, a final, parting wound from the place that had been his prison. Once on the other side, he didn't look back. He was on the main county road now, a wider, more established track, but one that offered no more comfort. The world, which had been confined to the familiar misery of the farm, now opened up into a terrifyingly vast and empty darkness, an endless expanse of night and rain and wind that seemed to stretch onto the very edge of the world. The initial adrenaline rush faded quickly, replaced by a deep, aching exhaustion that settled into his muscles like lead. He had been running on pure fear, and now his body was beginning to pay the price. A brutal cramp seized his right calf, a knot of fire that forced him to a stumbling halt. He cried out, the sound immediately swallowed by the wind. He fell to one knee, the impact sending a jarring shock up his leg, and he pressed his muddy hands against the spasming muscle, trying to knead the pain away. The thought of giving up returned, no longer a seductive whisper but a loud, rational voice in his head. He could just lie here. He could curl up in the ditch by the side of the road and let the storm take him. It would be an end to the pain, an end to the fear, an end to the crushing, unbearable weight of being alone. But then his hand, pressing against his leg, brushed the side of his coat, and he felt the familiar, reassuring outline of the stitched patch on the inside. His mother's face materialized in the darkness of his mind, her expression not one of pity, but of fierce, unwavering belief. For when life gets impossible. The words were a lifeline thrown across a chasm of despair. This was it. This was the impossible moment. To quit now would be to let her down, to break the last promise that connected him to her. He grit his teeth against the pain in his leg, the anger at his own weakness momentarily overwhelming the exhaustion. He was not just a boy running from an abusive uncle. He was the keeper of a sacred trust, the carrier of his mother's last, desperate hope. The pain in his leg was temporary. The betrayal of her memory would be eternal. He forced himself back to his feet, the cramp slowly receding into a dull, persistent throb. He started walking again, his gait now a clumsy limp, and tried to focus on the road ahead. But in the disorienting darkness, with no moon or stars to guide him, the world was a featureless void. The road seemed to disappear a few feet in front of him, swallowed by the blackness. He came to an unexpected fork, two paths diverging into the night, neither one more promising than the other. He had no idea which one led to Broken Bow. A fresh wave of panic tightened its icy grip around his chest. To choose wrong would be to waste what little energy he had left, to wander aimlessly into the empty prairie until he collapsed. He stood frozen at the junction, the wind whipping his hair into his eyes, a lost child at a crossroads that could determine his very survival. Just as the paralysis of indecision threatened to consume him, The sky to the west tore itself open with a brilliant, jagged spear of lightning. For a single, silent second, the entire world was illuminated in a stark, ghostly white. In that fleeting moment of clarity, he saw the landscape laid bare. The path to the right curved away toward a distant, dark line of hills, while the one to the left stretched out straighter, following the faint, skeletal outlines of telephone poles that marched westward across the plains. He knew instinctively that the poles would follow the main route to town. The light vanished as quickly as it came, plunging him back into an even deeper darkness, but the image was burned into his memory. It was a sign, a moment of impossible luck in a night of impossible odds. He didn't hesitate. He took the left fork, his heart pounding with a renewed sense of hope. He had been walking for what felt like another hour when a new sound cut through the howl of the wind, a low mechanical growl that seemed to be coming from behind him, from the direction of the farm. His blood ran cold. It was the sound of an engine, sputtering and angry, just like Vernon's old truck. The thought that his uncle might be coming after him was a terror far greater than the storm or the darkness. He didn't know what Vernon would do if he caught him, but he knew it would be the end. He scrambled off the road, his injured leg screaming in protest, and threw himself into the muddy, water-filled ditch that ran alongside it. He pressed his body flat against the cold, wet earth, pulling his head down, trying to make himself as small and invisible as a field mouse hiding from a hawk. He held his breath, listening, his entire world reduced to that one terrifying sound. He lay there for what felt like an eternity, his heart hammering against his ribs so hard he was sure it could be heard over the storm. The sound of the engine grew slightly louder, then it seemed to hold steady, a constant, menacing drone in the distance. He squeezed his eyes shut, praying with a fervor he hadn't felt in years. He prayed to his mother, to a God he wasn't sure he believed in, to anyone who might be listening. Let him not see me. Let him pass. But the sound never got closer, and after several long, agonizing minutes, he realized it wasn't moving. It was a stationary sound, perhaps a pump engine from a distant farm, or just the wind playing tricks on his frayed nerves. The immediate threat was an illusion, a phantom born of his own fear, but the terror it had produced was devastatingly real, leaving him shaking and weak in the cold mud. The phantom threat, however, left a residue of adrenaline that he used as fuel. The fear of being caught, even if imagined, was a more potent motivator than the cold or the pain. He scrambled out of the ditch, no longer just walking but forcing himself into a clumsy, limping run. He had to put as much distance as possible between himself and that farm. Every shadow seemed to morph into the shape of his uncle. Every gust of wind sounded like his name being called in anger. He ran blindly, recklessly, his feet slipping and sliding on the slick surface of the road. His ankle, already tender from the earlier fall, twisted violently in a deep, unseen rut. A white-hot, searing pain shot up his leg, and he went down hard, his chin striking the ground with a force that made his teeth rattle in his skull. This time, the pain was not a cramp that could be willed away. It was a sharp, insistent agony that radiated from his ankle with every beat of his heart. He lay in the middle of the road, gasping, the taste of blood and mud in his mouth. He knew with a sickening certainty that he couldn't run anymore. He might not even be able to walk. The fragile determination that had carried him this far finally shattered, leaving behind only the raw, jagged edges of despair. The 20 kilometers to Broken Bow no longer felt like a journey. It felt like an impossible, astronomical distance. He had failed. He had taken his mother's gift, her final act of love, and he had squandered it, only to die alone in the mud a few miles from where he had started. The tears he had held back for so long finally came, hot and silent, mixing with the cold rain on his face. He allowed himself to break for only a minute. He let the sobs shake his body, a violent, purging release of all the fear and pain and loneliness he had carried for 3 years. Then, a quiet thought cut through the storm of his grief. His mother had not given him the $5 so he could die crying. She had given it to him so he could live. He didn't know how, but he knew he had to get up. He used his hands and his one good leg to push himself into a sitting position. He tore a strip of fabric from the hem of his already ruined shirt and, with clumsy, shaking fingers, wrapped it tightly around his swelling ankle, creating a crude makeshift brace. The act of doing something, of taking some small measure of control in a situation that was completely out of his control, was enough to rekindle a tiny, flickering ember of resolve in the cold darkness of his soul. He couldn't walk, not properly, but he found he could move. He used the fence that ran alongside the road for support, half-hopping, half-dragging his injured leg behind him. His progress was agonizingly slow, a painful, shuffling journey measured in inches rather than miles. He began to count the fence posts as he passed them, a simple, repetitive task to occupy his mind and keep the despair at bay. 1, 2, 3. Each post was a small victory, a monument to his refusal to surrender. The world became a blur of rain, mud, and the rough, splintered texture of weathered wood under his fingertips. He was no longer thinking about Broken Bow. His entire universe had shrunk to the space between one fence post and the next. That was the only journey that mattered now. Time lost all meaning. He moved through a state of pure, instinctual survival, his body acting on some primal command that his conscious mind had long since abandoned. He was aware of the world only as a series of raw, physical sensations, the burning in his lungs, the throbbing agony in his ankle, the relentless, biting cold, and the constant gnawing emptiness in his stomach. He was a creature of pain and motion, driven forward by a force he no longer understood. He was so focused on the next fence post, the next painful step, that he didn't immediately notice the subtle shift in the world around him. The violent, percussive drumming of the rain had softened, transitioning into a steady, almost gentle drizzle. The wind, which had been a constant howling assault, had lessened its fury, its voice now a mournful whisper rather than an enraged scream. He paused, leaning his full weight against a sturdy corner post, and looked to the east for the first time in what felt like days. The horizon, which had been a seamless wall of impenetrable black, now held a faint, almost imperceptible line of bruised, greyish-purple light. It was the dawn. He had made it through the night. He had walked and crawled and limped through the storm. And he was still alive, still moving forward. The sight of that fragile, nascent light was more beautiful and more profound than any sunrise he had ever witnessed. It was not a promise of warmth or comfort, not yet, but it was a promise of continuation. It was a testament to the simple, stubborn fact of his own survival. He had faced the impossible night, and he had endured. The coming light also brought a new urgency. He was exposed here, a lone, mud-caked figure on an open road. He needed to find a place to hide, to rest, before the world of men woke up, and his vulnerability was laid bare for all to see. A short distance ahead, he saw a dark, dense thicket of wild plum trees and brush, a small tangled island in the vast sea of the prairie. It offered the only cover in sight. With the last dregs of his strength, he pushed himself away from the fence and hobbled toward it, his focus now singular and absolute. The thicket was a sanctuary, a temporary harbor where he could catch his breath and gather what little strength he had left. It was a place to wait for the sun to rise on the first day of his new, uncertain life. He collapsed into the relative shelter of the trees, the dense leaves offering a surprising shield from the lingering drizzle. He was hidden from the road, cocooned in a small pocket of damp, earthy darkness. He leaned his back against the rough trunk of a tree, the throbbing in his ankle a constant rhythmic reminder of the ordeal he had just survived. He was cold, he was hungry, and he was in more pain than he had ever known. But as he sat there, listening to the birds begin their first hesitant morning calls, a strange and unfamiliar feeling settled over him. It was not hope, not yet. It was something smaller, more fragile, but infinitely more precious. It was the quiet, profound, and undeniable knowledge that despite everything, he was still here. He had survived. And for now that was enough. He arrived in Broken Bow as the sun was just beginning to burn the mist off the fields, a small, limping ghost caked in the mud of the previous night's storm. He followed the slow trickle of farmers and townspeople toward the courthouse square, where a municipal auction was already underway. A fast-talking auctioneer stood on a wooden crate, his voice a rhythmic chant that echoed off the brick buildings as he sold off the remnants of broken lives. A tractor, a team of mules, a family's furniture laid bare on the dusty ground. Harlan watched in silence, the $5 bill in his coat, a useless pittance in a world of such large, sad numbers. He felt a familiar despair begin to creep back in, a cold certainty that he had survived the night only to starve in the light of day. He was an outsider, a piece of driftwood washed up on the shore of a community that had no room for him, and the finality of his situation felt absolute and crushing. Just as he was about to turn and limp away to find some dark alley to hide in, the auctioneer announced the final lot. His voice was laced with derision as he described an abandoned concrete silo on the edge of town, its structure cracked, its contents unknown. It had belonged to a man named Josiah Blackwood, who had sealed it shut and vanished years ago, leaving behind a property now considered more of a liability than an asset. He asked for an opening bid, and the crowd responded with a heavy, dismissive silence, punctuated by a few scornful chuckles. No one wanted the cursed, useless thing. In that moment of collective rejection, his mother's words echoed in his mind, clear and urgent. For when life gets impossible. This was it. With a heart hammering against his ribs, Harlan stepped out from the shadows. His voice was a reedy, uncertain thing, but it carried in the sudden quiet as he offered the only thing he had in the entire world, $5. A wave of laughter rippled through the crowd, but the auctioneer, eager to be done, slammed his gavel down. The boy now owned the silo. As the crowd dispersed, shaking their heads at the orphan's folly, one man remained. He was old, with hands as large and calloused as worn leather aprons, and his eyes, unlike the others, held no trace of mockery. He introduced himself as Solomon Burke, the town blacksmith. He looked from Harlan's exhausted, mud-stained face to the deed clutched in his hand and simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of a desperation he seemed to understand. He didn't ask questions or offer pity. Instead, he led Harlan to his forge at the edge of town, the air thick with the metallic scent of hot iron and coal smoke. From the organized clutter of his workshop, he produced a heavy sledgehammer, a sturdy shovel with a smooth, worn handle, and a wheelbarrow with a tireless wheel. He offered them to the boy on loan, a simple, profound act of trust in a world that had offered none. It was the first kindness Harlan had received in 3 years, and it felt like a shield against the ridicule of the entire town. The silo stood like a forgotten monument against the vast Nebraska sky, a gray, cracked cylinder of concrete 20 meters high. A thick, reinforced seal covered the opening at its base, a clear message from its previous owner that it was meant to remain closed forever. For the rest of that first day, Harlan attacked the seal with the sledgehammer. The work was brutal, jarring every bone in his already aching body. Each swing was a grunt of pure, focused effort, the heavy hammerhead striking the concrete with a deafening crack that sent shockwaves up his arms. Dust and chips of stone flew into the air, stinging his eyes and coating his skin. By late afternoon, exhausted and trembling, he had made a hole just large enough to crawl through. He slipped inside, leaving the bright hot sun behind for a world of absolute darkness and the suffocating, musty stench of 12 years of decay. The air was thick and stagnant, a physical presence that clung to the back of his throat. The true scope of his $5 purchase was revealed in the gloom. The silo was filled nearly to the top with compacted rotten wheat, a solid mass of spoiled grain that had settled and hardened over more than a decade. His heart sank. This wasn't an empty space. It was a vertical tomb he would have to excavate by hand. From that day forward, his life found a new punishing rhythm. He would wake with the sun, crawl into the silo, and begin to dig. He shoveled the putrid, foul-smelling grain into the wheelbarrow, hauled it outside, dumped it, and returned for another load. The work was relentless, a monotonous cycle of digging and hauling that pushed his 13-year-old body to its absolute limit. He worked until the sun went down, his muscles screaming with a fatigue so profound it felt permanent. At night, he would climb to the empty upper portion of the silo, curl up on the cold concrete, and fall into a dreamless, exhausted sleep. He was driven by a single, desperate thought. He had to make his mother's $5 mean something. It could not be a final, foolish gesture that ended with him starving to death in a forgotten silo. It had to be an investment, a foundation, the first step toward the impossible future she had willed for him. This singular focus became a wall against the pain, the loneliness, and the gnawing hunger. He survived on the meager scraps of food Mr. Burke would quietly leave for him each morning and the water he drew from a nearby creek. He spoke to no one. The silo became his entire world, a private universe of dust, sweat, and the steady, rhythmic scrape of his shovel against the grain. He was completely alone, but for the first time in years his solitude was a choice and his labor had a purpose, even if he didn't yet know what that purpose was. It happened on the 14th day. He was deep inside the silo, working by the dim light filtering through the hole he had made. He was nearly 15 meters down, the air thick with the dust of decay, a suffocating cloud that burned his eyes and clung to the back of his throat. He was little more than skin stretched over bone, moving on autopilot, his mind numb with exhaustion. He lifted the shovel for what felt like the millionth time and drove it down into the compacted grain. But instead of the familiar soft resistance of decaying wheat, the shovel struck something hard. It wasn't stone. It was a dull, solid thud that vibrated up the wooden handle and into the very marrow of his bones. The sound was so alien, so unexpected in this uniform world of rot, that for a moment he simply froze. The shovel still in his hands, his heart suddenly pounding a frantic wild rhythm against his ribs. He dropped the shovel and fell to his knees, his exhaustion forgotten, replaced by a surge of raw primal energy. He clawed at the remaining layers of grain with his bare hands, his fingers raw and bleeding, not even noticing the pain. He dug with a frantic, desperate intensity, pulling away handfuls of the foul-smelling filth until his fingers brushed against a cool, curved surface. It was wood. He kept digging, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps, until the dark, rounded top of an oak barrel slowly emerged from the gloom, and then another and another next to it. He had not found an empty space. He had found a hidden floor, a perfectly arranged cache of barrels stretching across the entire diameter of the silo. They were clean, their staves tight and unstained, perfectly preserved beneath the mountain of grain that had acted as a protective seal against the elements and the passage of time. He focused on a single barrel, his hands trembling so violently he could barely work. He used the edge of his shovel to pry at the bung, the small wooden plug that sealed it shut. The wood was swollen tight, and it took the last of his strength, a final, desperate heave that left him gasping for air, to work it loose. With a soft pop, the bung came free. A rich, potent, and completely unfamiliar aroma billowed out of the opening, filling the small, excavated space. It was the scent of oak, of rye, of char, and time itself, the deep, woody perfume of aged whiskey. It was the smell of a secret, the scent of a treasure he could not yet comprehend, but whose significance he felt in his very soul. It was the smell of an answer to a question he hadn't even known how to ask. And it was there, in the dusty darkness at the bottom of his $5 silo, surrounded by the ghosts of a forgotten past, that Harlan Dean Whitaker finally broke. He did not shout in triumph or gasp in wonder. He simply collapsed against the rough, curved side of the oak barrel and began to weep. It was not a quiet, mournful crying, but a storm of tears, a raw, racking cascade of sobs that shook his entire emaciated frame. He cried for the 2 weeks of back-breaking labor, for the 3 years of silent servitude, for the crushing loneliness of a childhood lost. But mostly, he cried from a place of overwhelming, impossible relief. He was not crying for the potential fortune that lay buried around him. He was crying because the $5, that final desperate act of a dying mother's love, had led him here. Against all odds, against all logic, she had kept her promise. He was safe. After the initial storm of tears subsided, leaving him hollowed out and trembling against the rough oak, Harlan felt a strange sense of clarity settle over him. The immediate, desperate need for survival that had driven him for 2 weeks had been answered. But a new, deeper question began to form in the dusty silence of the silo. Why this? Why would a man named Josiah Blackwood fill a silo with a fortune in whiskey, only to bury it under tons of worthless, rotting grain? It didn't feel like a simple hiding place. It felt like a tomb, a deliberate act of burial. A profound and unsettling curiosity began to stir beneath his exhaustion, a sense that the story of this place was not yet fully told, that the barrels themselves were only the first chapter, of a much larger, darker narrative that he had unwittingly unearthed from the suffocating depths of the past. He pushed himself away from the barrel, his limbs still weak, and began to move through the small, excavated space he had carved out. He ran his hands over the tops of the other barrels, his fingers tracing the faint, stenciled markings that were barely visible in the dim light. They were all identical, a silent army of oak and iron standing guard in the darkness. But as he reached the very center of the circular arrangement, his hand brushed against something different. One barrel, set in the precise heart of the silo, felt wrong. Its top was not bare wood. It was capped with a thin, circular sheet of lead, carefully hammered and sealed around the rim. It was a detail so deliberate, so out of place, that it sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through him. This was not a barrel of whiskey. This was a container for something else, something its creator had taken extraordinary measures to protect from the ravages of time and moisture. A new kind of energy, born of mystery rather than desperation, flooded his veins. He worked with a renewed, almost feverish intensity, using the edge of his shovel as a lever to pry at the lead seal. The metal was soft but stubbornly fused to the wood, and it took him nearly an hour of careful, painstaking work to peel back one edge. Beneath the lead, there was another layer of protection, a thick disc of pine heavily coated in black, sticky tar. He chipped away at it, the acrid smell of the tar filling the air until he finally exposed the barrel's true wooden lid. It was not held in place by a simple bung, but by small, hand-forged iron clasps. This was a time capsule. It was a vault. It was a message, sent from a dead man across a decade of silence, and Harlan knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it was meant for him. He broke the clasps with the head of the shovel and lifted the heavy lid. The scent that rose to meet him was not of alcohol, but of old paper and dry, decaying leather. Nestled inside, resting on a bed of dry straw, was a heavy, oilcloth-wrapped bundle. His hands trembled as he lifted it out. It was surprisingly heavy, dense with a significance that went far beyond its physical weight. He carefully unwrapped the oilcloth, his heart pounding a slow, heavy drumbeat against his ribs. Inside was a thick, leather-bound ledger, its cover embossed with the faded gold letters, J.B. Distillery Accounts, 1919-1925. Tucked inside the front cover was a single folded letter, the paper yellowed and brittle with age, sealed with a hard red wax droplet that had long since lost its insignia. This was the true treasure of the silo. He sat on the cold concrete floor, the ledger resting in his lap, and carefully broke the wax seal on the letter. The paper crackled in protest as he unfolded it. The handwriting inside was a steady, elegant script. The ink faded from black to a rusty brown, but still perfectly legible in the sliver of light from above. It began without salutation, a direct address to the unknown future. It was the final testament of Josiah Blackwood, written on the last night of his life in the summer of 1925. He wrote not of his whiskey, but of his betrayal. He described a silent partner, a man who had financed his operation, a man of wealth and influence in the town of Broken Bow, a man who had systematically cheated him, using his knowledge of the law to create fraudulent contracts that slowly siphoned away Blackwood's ownership of his own creation. The letter was a confession and an indictment. Blackwood admitted to being a distiller during Prohibition, but he described his craft with a simple, quiet pride, speaking of the art of turning Nebraska rye into something that could warm a man's soul. He was not a gangster, but an artisan, a man who loved his work. But his partner, he wrote, loved only money and power. As the value of the aged whiskey grew, so did his partner's greed. Blackwood knew his partner was planning to kill him, to take everything. He knew he would not live to see the next sunrise. This silo, this whiskey, this letter, it was his only recourse. He had sealed his life's work away not just to hide it, but to create a weapon, a time bomb of truth that would one day expose the man who was about to murder him. And then, at the bottom of the page, Harlan read the name of the silent partner, and the air left his lungs in a single, ragged gasp. The name was Crawford Pierce. The world tilted on its axis. Crawford Pierce, the banker, the man who now owned the Whitaker homestead. The man whose name Vernon had spat out with such venom on the night he had thrown Harlan into the storm. It was not a coincidence. It was a pattern, a terrible predatory thread that connected the ghost of Josiah Blackwood to his own shattered life. The man who had destroyed his family's farm was the same man who had murdered the owner of this silo. He was not just a ruthless banker, he was a killer, a thief who had been building an empire on the ruins of other men's lives for years. The injustice of it was a physical weight, a suffocating pressure in his chest. He, a 13-year-old boy, was now the sole keeper of a secret that could bring the most powerful man in the county to ruin. He opened the ledger, his fingers tracing the neat columns of figures. It was a meticulous record of every barrel, every transaction, every secret payment made to Crawford Pierce. It detailed the systematic fraud, the doctored numbers, the illegal transfers of ownership. It was undeniable proof of a long and calculated crime, culminating in murder. Josiah Blackwood had not just left a story, he had left a meticulously documented case, a prosecutor's dream sealed in a barrel. He had armed the future against his own killer. Harlan felt a profound, almost spiritual connection to the dead man. He was not alone in his suffering. Another man, a decade earlier, had stood against the same darkness, and in his final moments had placed his faith in a stranger in a future he would never see, in the hope that justice, no matter how delayed, was not impossible. A new resolve, cold and hard as steel, settled in his heart. This was no longer just about his own survival. It was about honoring the last wish of a murdered man. It was about justice for Josiah Blackwood. It was about exposing the rot that had hollowed out his own life and countless others. He carefully rewrapped the ledger and the letter in the oilcloth, his movements now precise and deliberate. He knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed help. And his mind immediately went to the one person in Broken Bow who had shown him a shred of human decency, the one man who had not laughed at his $5 purchase. He needed to find Solomon Burke. The old blacksmith had not offered him pity, he had offered him tools, and now Harlan was bringing him a tool of a different kind, a weapon made of paper and ink. He climbed out of the silo into the bright afternoon sun, the world outside seeming strangely unreal after the dusty gloom below. He felt older, as if he had aged a decade in the last few hours. He walked into town, the heavy bundle clutched to his chest, his limp forgotten. He found Mr. Burke at his forge, hammering a glowing piece of iron into the shape of a horseshoe, the rhythmic clang of his work a steady, comforting heartbeat in the quiet town. The old man stopped his work when he saw the look on Harlan's face, a mixture of terror and determination that spoke of a discovery far more significant than spoiled grain. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of a leather-gloved hand and simply waited, his wise, patient eyes fixed on the boy. Harlan didn't speak at first. He just stepped forward and placed the oilcloth bundle on the anvil, the heat from the recently worked metal warming the leather. He unwrapped it, revealing the ledger and the letter. Solomon Burke's eyes widened slightly as he saw the embossed title on the ledger. He picked up the letter, his large, calloused fingers surprisingly gentle as he handled the brittle paper. He read it slowly, his expression unreadable. The only sound in the forge, the soft hiss of cooling iron and the distant buzz of late-summer insects. He read it once and then he read it again, a deep, profound silence settling over the workshop. Harlan stood perfectly still, his breath held tight in his chest, waiting for a verdict he did not yet understand. The entire weight of the past and the future seemed to hang suspended in that single silent moment. When Solomon finally looked up from the letter, the kind, simple blacksmith was gone. In his place was a man Harlan had never seen before, a man with eyes as sharp and piercing as a hawk's, filled with a cold, righteous anger that seemed to draw all the heat from the forge into itself. He looked at Harlan, and for the first time he spoke of his own past. He explained that he hadn't always been a blacksmith in Nebraska. For 30 years, he had been a prosecuting attorney in Chicago, a man who had put murderers and thieves behind bars. He had retired to Broken Bow to escape the corruption and violence of the city, hoping to find a quieter life. But the letter in his hand, he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, proved that evil was not a feature of the city but a condition of the human heart, and it could grow just as dark and twisted in the soil of the prairie. He placed a heavy hand on Harlan's shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. He looked from the letter to the boy's determined face and saw the same thing Josiah Blackwood must have hoped for, a vessel for justice. He told Harlan that he had done more than just find some old whiskey. He had unearthed a truth that the town had been too scared or too blind to see for a decade. He explained that the whiskey itself, distilled in 1919 and aged for 12 years, was not just contraband, but a historical artifact, a liquid time capsule from before Prohibition. Its value was immense, but the value of the truth in the ledger was immeasurable. He told Harlan that they were going to take this evidence to the county sheriff, and that the long, comfortable reign of Crawford Pierce was about to come to a violent and final end. In that moment, standing in the hot, smoky air of the forge, Harlan felt the last of his childhood fear fall away, replaced by a sense of profound purpose. He was no longer a victim, a discarded piece of refuse. He was a witness. He was an agent of a justice that had been sleeping for a decade, waiting for someone to give it a voice. The $5 his mother had stitched into his coat had not just bought him a silo, it had bought him a place in a story much larger than his own. It had connected him to the ghost of Josiah Blackwood and the hidden past of Solomon Burke. He was not alone. He had never truly been alone. His mother's love had been a thread, pulling him through the darkness, leading him not just to safety, but to this exact moment, to this forge, to this alliance that would finally bring the monster who haunted their town into the light. The 2 years that followed were a lifetime, while the wheels of justice turned slowly, grinding Crawford Pierce's empire to dust. Harlan found something he had long ago stopped believing was possible: a home. Solomon Burke and his wife, a kind, quiet Lakota woman named Morning Star, took him in without hesitation. They didn't officially adopt him at first. They simply made a space for him at their table, in their lives and in their hearts. For the first time in years, he ate until he was full. He slept in a real bed, under a warm quilt that smelled of cedar and wood smoke. He learned the rhythm of the forge, the art of heating and shaping metal, the satisfaction of creating something strong and useful with his own hands. He learned the quiet wisdom of Morning Star, who taught him the names of the prairie grasses and the stories of the stars. He was no longer a ghost. He was a boy again. The trial of Crawford Pierce was the biggest event the county had ever seen. The ledger, authenticated by experts, laid bare a decade of fraud and theft, revealing that nearly a third of the farms foreclosed on during the Depression had been illegally acquired. The letter from Josiah Blackwood was read aloud in the courtroom, his voice from the grave a chilling testament to Pierce's final, brutal crime. In the end, the banker was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. The properties he had stolen, including the original Whitaker homestead, were ordered to be returned to their rightful families. A quiet, collective sigh of relief seemed to pass over the entire county, as if a long, low-grade fever had finally broken. Justice had been done, and the balance had been restored. With the repeal of Prohibition in 1933, the 60 barrels of 12-year-old rye whiskey became legally and immensely valuable. Solomon Burke, using the last of his old Chicago connections, negotiated the sale of the entire lot to a Kentucky distillery. The final sum was staggering, a number that Harlan could barely comprehend: $112,000. It was a fortune that could have sent him anywhere in the world, but he knew exactly what he had to do. He used a portion of the money to purchase the finest lumber, the strongest nails, and the best tools he could find. He returned to the Whitaker farm, not as the broken boy who had been cast out, but as the man who had come to rebuild it. He tore down the sagging fences and the rotting barn, and with his own hands and the help of Solomon, he brought his parents' home back to life. He never saw his Uncle Vernon again. He learned years later that Vernon had drifted aimlessly after losing the farm, a bitter and broken man who eventually died penniless in an indigent home a decade later. Harlan felt no hatred for him, only a distant, hollow pity for a life so completely consumed by its own resentment. His focus was on the future, on honoring the past. He officially became Harlan Burke, the son of Solomon and Morning Star, the family he had chosen and who had chosen him. They lived together on the rebuilt farm, the land once again productive and alive, a testament not to what was lost, but to what could be reclaimed through courage and an impossible stroke of grace. It was a quiet life, a good life, filled with the simple dignity of hard work and the profound warmth of unconditional love. His final act of transformation concerned the silo. The grey, cracked monument to his own survival and Josiah Blackwood's demise could not be left as a simple memorial. He used the last of the whiskey money to repair and modernize it, installing new machinery and reinforcing its structure. But he did not use it for himself. He converted it into a low-cost cooperative grain storage facility for the small independent farmers in the area. It was his promise, made to the ghost of Josiah Blackwood and to himself, that no one else in their community would ever be ruined by the greed of men like Crawford Pierce. The silo, once a symbol of desperation and a tomb of secrets, became a beacon of community and a shield for the vulnerable, ensuring that the cycle of predation was broken for good. Harlan Dean Burke lived on that farm until he passed away peacefully at the age of 81. He lived to see the world change in ways he could never have imagined on that stormy August night. He saw droughts and wars, prosperity and peace. But through it all, he remained a quiet, steady man, a man who understood the true value of things. He never forgot the feel of the cold mud, the terror of the endless night or the suffocating dust of the silo. And he never forgot the source of his salvation, a mother's foresight, a stranger's trust and a $5 bill, invested with love and faith at the precise moment when life had become truly, utterly impossible.